Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Total Biscuit, and we've got ourselves a port report here for GTA 5 on PC. It's loading right into story mode, which I actually didn't want it to do. I wish it wouldn't do that, but it does have the tendency to do it, so never mind, we'll just deal with that regardless. Well, we've been waiting for GTA 5 for quite some time, and the expectation as to whether or not the port, or just PC version, whichever you prefer, a lot of people have been saying you can't call it a port. PC version's been in development for years, it's not just a port. I think it's just a term that a lot of people use. Let's turn that radio off immediately before we end up getting copyright strike. Thank you very much, video game. There we go. Call it whatever you want, doesn't really matter, it's the PC version one way or the other, and welcome to it. And you can probably notice in the background, the frame rate's looking pretty good at the moment, isn't it? Yes, it is for the most part. Running SLI 980s for this. I've got for you some benchmark footage which will compare the performance of one 980 to 2, although what I have found is the benchmark footage is not necessarily representative of the way that the game actually runs. And we're also going to talk through some options, so let's actually begin with that right now. Have a look at the options. And for those who don't have a lot of time, who just simply want the question asked, is the port any good? Is the PC version up to snuff? For the most part, yes, it is. And you can feel pretty safe in buying it, although there are a couple of caveats. So let's have a look at settings. There are a lot of settings, huge amounts of settings to go through here. So you do have your gamepad, and you've got a decent amount of options associated with said gamepad. What you can also do with the gamepad, which is really quite nice, got a random frame drop there for no reason, not really sure what's going on with that, is that you can switch seamlessly between gamepad and mouse and keyboard, which actually is pretty handy if you really don't like driving with the keyboard, but you like, say, shooting with the keyboard and mouse, which is understandable. So you can switch between the two of them. It will switch the button prompts, let's try that again, button prompts, instantly without too much of a problem. And it's actually a pretty good way to play the game, at least in my honest opinion. I do like driving with the pad, but the aiming with the keyboard and mouse is just so much better, particularly when you're doing things like drive-by shootings, which require a rather alien set of hand inputs on the pad and are just very seamless and easy to do with the keyboard and mouse. But you do have a lot of options there associated with that, and you can also calibrate the gamepad as well, if you so desire, which will allow you to calibrate a few different buttons. Now, if you go to keyboard and mouse, you do have key rebinding available here. It's actually under a separate menu there. But under keyboard and mouse, it defaults to raw input, which is nice. There doesn't appear to be any mouse acceleration, at least not that I've noticed. Although, I do find the game to be perhaps a little bit clumsy in terms of its aiming and things like running. But I believe that's actually a deliberate design choice from the folks over at Rockstar. And GTA's been like that for quite some time. It's not Call of Duty. It's not supposed to feel really snappy and super accurate all the time. And I think that a lot of that is also exacerbated by the first-person mode, where it's made even more obvious that the gunplay is somewhat more clumsy than your average first-person shooter would be. I don't think it's got anything to do with anything like mouse acceleration, though, so you can bear that one in mind. You've got a lot of options here. They really have put a great deal of effort into this. I have to admit that. It's very difficult to look at this and say, yeah, they didn't care about the PC version. They bloody well did. I mean, for God's sake, look at this. You've got multiple sensitivities for pretty much every vehicle. You've even got submarine sensitivity. I wasn't even aware the game had a bloody submarine in it. So there you go. Now, if we head on over to audio, you've got separate volume sliders for sound effects, music, and dialogue boost, which is nice. Not all games actually have dialogue boost. I do like it when they include this. And it's the ability to sort of push the dialogue above the general racket and ruckus of the game, which I find to be particularly good if you're recording a video, for instance. It's always nice to have that. You got your radio station options. You also have a self-radio mode, and you can scan for music. Apparently there's a way of setting up your own radio station. I don't know how to do that. It doesn't seem to tell you in-game, so I'm not really sure what's on with that. But you can also select different outputs. You can go for television, surround sound, speakers, stereo speakers, and headphones, which is going to change the way that the audio actually works there as well. And you can mute audio on focus loss, that being Alt-Tab if you so desire. Alt-tabbing, incidentally, doesn't work particularly well with this game. That's something to bear in mind. If you do want it to work better, you'll probably want to consider borderless window mode, but I found that it causes keyboard lag when you Alt-tab out and leave it in the background, so you're probably going to have a few problems. If you're the sort of person that plays a bit, Alt-tabs out, goes back in, you'll find that suddenly your typing gets more sluggish. It's a very strange thing. It's not the first game that's had that problem, but this game does have that issue, so just bear that in mind. Lots of camera options here. You've got your first person on field of view. This is sort of my first biggest gripe. One, what is this? This is a bar. What does this mean versus this? I don't know, because they didn't put any actual numbers on it. The main problem is that even at maximum FOV, it's still not that wide. People are estimating around 75 to 80 at the most, which is not enough for some people. And the gun models are also bloody well huge, which certainly doesn't help. So just bear that in mind if you're going to be using the first-person view a lot. Thankfully, of course, first-person in this game is entirely optional, although it is a neat little feature to have nonetheless. Now, outside of that, you can customize all sorts of things like ragdolls, combat rolls, and just everything you can possibly desire. Now, let's head on to display. Again, lots of great options here. You can turn off GPS if you so desire. You can change the type of reticle you use as well as the size of it. You can turn the HUD off if you prefer a cleaner experience. You can turn the radar off, again, for the same reason. Subtitles options are available. We're going to turn that on for obvious reasons since we're doing a video here. I was a little disappointed not to see any sort of color-deficient options. That's the sort of thing that I would have perhaps expected from a big-budget game. But if they are here, they're not to be found in display, which is where you would usually find them. So that's a little bit disappointing, of course, for those who have color blindness and color deficiency issues. Now let's move on to graphics. First big problem here, you might be noticing that it's claiming I've got 8 gigabytes of video RAM. That's not true. That's not how SLI works. So what it's doing is it's actually adding the two cards together and saying that's how much video memory I have. That's not true. That's not the way SLI works. You don't get double the VRAM if you have two cards. But what it also seems to be doing is doubling the VRAM requirements for everything. So really, that bar shouldn't really make too much of a difference for you. If you're running an SLI setup, you should still be fine. It's just bear in mind that everything's going to be multiplied by 2, 3, or 4, depending on how many cards you've got. I did try it, of course, with a single card, and it cut this value in half here. It was saying that I was only using about 2.6 gigs of the 4 gigs of video RAM that I have. This bar is otherwise, though, quite useful, because it is going to give you something of an indicator as to what kind of performance hits you're going to be taking from certain options. We could demonstrate that. Like if I change the resolution, for instance, if I crank this all the way up to 2560 by 1440, it's going to say, hey, you're going to be using more video RAM, better watch out for that. Now, video RAM is not the sole decider of performance by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a helpful indicator nonetheless. You got aspect ratio and refresh rate support here. And you can even change the output monitor, which is lovely. You've got 3 kinds of anti-aliasing. Well, technically 2 kinds and TXAA. So FXAA is the fast approximate anti-aliasing, and then you've got MSAA, which is a little bit more advanced. It's going to take a little bit more horsepower, and you can also put TXAA on top of that. MSAA times 4 is very demanding. Very demanding. Now, it's not just on the VRAM. Times 8, of course, is even more ridiculous. It is seriously demanding on your actual card, and we will demonstrate some of that in a moment. VSync on or off, pause game and focus lock, and then you've got all of these. So you can customize things like population density and distance scaling. So that's basically level of detail and things like pop-in and the ability to see far off into the distance. I would recommend maxing that out, because even maxed out, it's maybe not that great. And then you've got all of these options here as well. Is there anything missing? Nothing obvious. Nothing really springs to mind. You even have DirectX 11 tessellation options here as well. So there's lots of things. And then, of course, you've got advanced graphics. Now, if you have any performance problems whatsoever, the first thing I would do is restore defaults here, because some of these are ridiculous when it comes to system requirements. These are very, very high performance options. Now, you might see some of that in the video RAM thing right here, and then sometimes you won't, which is a little bit weird. It's like, I can crank this up to maximum. This actually has a significant frame rate impact, and I've also noticed if you crank up things like long shadows, high-resolution shadows, I mean, not only will it have a big jump in video RAM requirements, it's also going to cause hitching. I had some of these options turned on when I first played the game, and I noticed sort of Far Cry 4 style hitching where the game's frame rate would drop dramatically while it was loading in the next section of the game. These options appear to be the culprits. If you're having any problems with performance, the first thing you should do is turn these bloody things off, because you need a beast of a machine to run these properly, and I'll demonstrate a little bit of that in a moment. Outside of that, voice chat, you can turn that on or off immediately. Again, we've got this random frame drop. I'm really not sure where that's actually coming from. It's very strange. And it's actually maintaining it. There we go, and now we've got it back. It's a little bit weird. I've never really noticed that happening outside of the options menu. Then you got things like notifications, the Rockstar editor, and you can even change it so that it will not load automatically into story mode the way that we saw there, but unfortunately it will load into one of the two, either GTA Online or story mode, directly from the landing page, unless you go into the options menu, in which case it will pause that. That is one gigantic options menu. There are not many complaints that I've got there. There's maybe a couple in terms of the way the game saves. I've come back into games and had it, like, go back a mission, for instance, because the game decided not to autosave at a particular point, and there is no quick save option as far as I am aware. So just bear that in mind. But outside of that, pretty good port options-wise. Now, we're going to have a look at some benchmarks, and then we're going to look at some real-world performance and mess around a little bit with the options and try and show you what it is that's going to really impact things. So let's move into the benchmarks that are available in the game, and then we'll look at real-world performance instead, and we'll have a look and see which of the options causes the most load and which options to tweak, and also have a look at things like texture quality and talk a little bit about the keyboard and mouse controls. Alright, so what you're going to see in the top right-hand corner is the single card, and the main screen being the 2 cards in SLI mode. Now, the benchmark tool available in this game, at least in my honest opinion, doesn't really give a great idea of how the game is actually going to run and the difference between the two. You'll notice the difference between the two is actually pretty minor in many areas, and in terms of real-world performance, particularly at night, you'll probably notice a significant boost in terms of frame rate when you're using SLI cards versus a single GPU card. However, in the benchmarks, there are times when you will notice a big difference, like here, for instance, where the SLI is able to stay above 60, whereas the single card is not, during a very high-intensity shadow-based scene with big lighting. And, of course, in this flyover as well, you're also going to notice that the single GPU card just can't stay above 60 with these settings, although it does tend to recover quite nicely in this area. A lot of the drops are pretty minor, from what I've noticed with playing a good few hours with a single GPU card. They're not exactly the sort of drops that should really bother people too much, but they do exist. And you will probably want to try and tweak your settings to make sure that those drops do not occur. For the most part, though, if you're running a setup like this, you should be expecting this game to be running at 60+. And, of course, you can attain 60+ on a wide variety of different setups. Although what I have noticed is that trying to get it much, much higher than that, particularly in the benchmark, is quite difficult. It seems like Rockstar shot for 60 and optimized for 60, and getting something like 120 or 144 if you're looking for the super high frame rates is going to be very difficult to do, at least if these benchmarks are anything to go by, without a ludicrous setup. And bear in mind, the options that I'm using for this do not have the advanced graphics options enabled, and that, particularly in the daytime, causes a significant drop in frame rate. Other than that, though, the performance of both looks pretty good, although you'd probably be surprised in many of these scenes to see the performance being identical, particularly in the daytime. You're actually noticing SLI dropping below the single card, which is a little bit weird there, to say the least. And what's even stranger is you'll notice that the GPU usage on the SLI setup drops while those frame rate drops are happening. So it appears that there's some sort of bottleneck elsewhere. As to what that bottleneck is, I couldn't really say, but for the most part, performance seems to be pretty damn solid in almost every area. Alright. Let's have a look at real-world performance. So you've seen the benchmarks. It's showing you a variety of different locations, showing you flying over the city and things like that. Shows you some of the things which have impact on frame rate. Now, here with both of my cards enabled, they're almost being maxed out, and we're getting about 110, 120 frames per second. It's running pretty damn well. Distribution across cores looks good as well, so it appears to multi-thread pretty well. And we're getting really good performance, honestly, as you would expect from a computer that has two 980s in it. It would be a little bit odd if you didn't. Now, with the option setup I currently have, you notice that I turned off all the options in advanced, and I have 2 times AA, but everything else is maxed out. And this is the kind of performance that you'll get on a setup like mine. Now, the question is, how well does it perform with a single card? Well, it performs fine. I noticed around 60-70 frames per second on one 980, whereas we're looking at more like 100-110 with two 980s. So SLI scaling is not awful. It does dip in some areas. It really depends in terms of what kind of lighting there is, in terms of how much stuff's on the screen and what area you're in, and things like weather effects. So those can have performance impacts, and of course the occasional pyrotechnics and big explosions and physics-based stuff can also have some performance impacts. I've actually seen some drops in some of the cutscenes, which is a little bit weird, but outside of that, the real-world gameplay is buttery smooth, at least running like this. Now, if I have one complaint, in terms of the game's graphical fidelity, and it is a good-looking game. It's not the best-looking game on PC, but it's pretty damn good-looking nonetheless, with some really nice depth of field and all sorts of things like that, is that the draw distance, by default, is not that great, and the way that they pop in textures and things like detail is very, very obvious. A little bit too obvious. I mean, it will just pop in without any effort, really, to disguise it. This isn't really so much of a problem, but you'll notice it a lot once you start to get on a highway. Lights will pop in, you'll see cars pop in the distance, and they'll do so very suddenly. And if you're going through a high detail area, you'll notice there's very obvious changes in the level of detail, from low detail in the distance to high detail. They don't really make any effort to disguise that fact, and you will notice it. It is certainly not something that I would view as particularly hard to see. Now, a lot of people just aren't bothered by that, and of course, you've got to bear in mind some of the technical limitations. We're just going to go drive on the train tracks because it's Grand Theft Auto, so why the hell not? It's the reality, I think, of modern games that you get a lot of that, but I look forward to the day when they've somehow figured out a way to make that less ridiculous, because you get some pretty silly things like light flickering at certain distances when you really shouldn't be getting that. And, of course, the invisible cars that are popping in. Now, I've got to say the view distance is pretty good. It's not really the view distance that I have a problem with for the most part. It is that level of detail that's popping in at certain distances and doing so, frankly, in a very non-discrete fashion. And it does take away somewhat from the immersion, and it takes away somewhat from the graphical fidelity of the game, because you're seeing it pop in so blatantly. You saw it a lot in the benchmark when you were in a plane, which is why, of course, there's an option for that. And now that I'm moving into the city, you're going to notice that my frame rate's going to start to drop a bit. In the outside areas of the city, yeah, 110, 120. Once you start getting into the city, there's a lot more lights, there's a lot more textures, there's a lot more actors on the screen, and there are a lot more cars to worry about. So you are going to see a drop in frame rate here, but if you're running a setup like this, you're not going to be running into too many performance issues, and even with a single 980, with these options, which are cranked up very, very high, you're going to be looking at about 60, 70 frames per second, so everything's looking pretty good there. What I do notice, which is a little bit weird, is that I get frame rate drops here, and yet my GPU usage actually goes down, not up, which is a little bit strange. I'm not really sure what exactly causes that to happen, but it is a thing. I couldn't speculate. I don't have the necessary technical knowledge, but there you go. So, performance is looking good, right? Alright, let's mess around with a few options and see what happens. So, these are the options that you're probably going to see will have some fairly major performance impacts. Let's go, like, to ×8. There we go. Let's apply this. There we go. Keep new settings. Yep. I would like to apply them now. Yes, we did say that previously. Thank you very much. Have we got them applied? Yes, we do. Cool. And that has a reasonably significant impact on the frame rate, but by no means enough to really put you off using it, at least in my honest opinion. If you have a setup like this, that full AA is definitely going to make a difference in terms of the visual fidelity, and this frame rate is more than playable. You know, it's absolutely acceptable for 8 times MSAA. So that's not too bad, but you will notice in some of the more crowded areas that you're going to get drops, and if you drop below 60, you'll probably notice that. So in this area, I'd probably be getting 80, 90, but I'm getting more like 60 if I crank the AA all the way up. So let's turn that off, and we'll look at some of the options which really have the big, big impact. So we're going to go back to 2 times here, and we can put TXAA on as well. But then when we go to advanced graphics, we're just going to apply this. There we go. These are the options that are going to hammer you. Things like long shadows, things like high-resolution shadows. This, of course, doesn't really matter right now, but we can turn... Let's go all the way up as far as we can possibly go here. And now it's saying that I am within the margin of error here, that I should be absolutely fine. But, of course, this is not indicative of all that much. So let's apply the changes here. Alright, so now we have the extended distance scaling turned all the way up to maximum. And it helps a little bit with the pop-in, but it's still not ideal. It's good to, like, sit here and watch some of the cars kind of disappear and reappear in the distance. And some of the lights just go off at random. You probably saw one right over there. Like, hey, there's a car there, and now there isn't a car, and then there's a car again. So even with the full-on distance scaling and everything cranked up to absolute maximum, the game still does have some pop-in issues. The actual performance, it really matters as to whether or not you're at day or night. You'll notice the performance hasn't gone down that much at night, and that's, of course, because your visibility is decreased. However, if you try this during the day... Radio off, thank you very much. Could do without being sued. Look, what happened to the frame rate? Yep, exactly. During the daytime, of course, the view distance increases, meaning that the frame rate drops, and it drops like a rock if you happen to have all of those options enabled. So now with two SLI 980s, we're looking at more like 60 frames per second. You might be saying, well, that's fine. Yeah, but it's two 980s. You'd expect a little bit more from that. So I would still honestly recommend that you have those settings off. And obviously on lesser cards, you're going to be hit even harder by this. This really is designed for people with, well, Titan X's, basically, and equivalent cards to that. So these are the sort of things that you should absolutely be considering turning off, and they will give you some of your frame rate back. Although you will still notice that during the day, your frame rate is lower than it will be during the night, and that's simply due to things like view distance. So there we go. We're back in, and suddenly we're back up to like 100 frames per second. You can see the clear difference there. All right. Not bad, right? Looks pretty good. Yeah, it does look pretty good. There are a couple of issues worth talking about. The first, of course, being this field of view that I was talking about earlier, so we could let's just get a gun out, shall we? No, that's my phone. I guess that kind of counts. Go away. Thank you. And we'll just select a gun. Let's go the assault rifle. There we go. There we go. So this is what it looks like in first person. The gun models are absolutely bloody enormous. Of that, there is really no doubt. It doesn't really feel like a kind of high-quality first-person shooter, but the first-person mode is still particularly fantastic, and a lot of people are going to be very, very interested in seeing how that actually ends up working. But it's not, I mean, it's not ideal. The field of view is still a little bit narrow, even at maximum settings, and some people are going to have problems with that. Thankfully, though, of course, it's optional, because you can just do that, and then the problem just disappears. Now, if we look at texture quality, it was obviously not designed to be this close, because you're going to notice some pretty gnarly textures. But again, the game was designed to be a third-person game. You were never supposed to get that close. This is how close you can actually get. You know, and you'd really have to tilt things around in a Total Biscuit wall-licking style to even notice. And even then, it's hard to notice really bad quality texture work. But go into that, and then you suddenly see it very, very clearly. But we are looking at a massive and pretty much seamless open world. That's, of course, the biggest thing to consider. It's a massive, seamless open world. And as a direct result, you have to bear in mind that you are going to notice some gnarly textures from time to time. That's just the reality of it. There's really not a lot to say about it. It's a giant world. They can't go with fantastic quality textures all the time. And they certainly don't. I mean, if you have a look at some of the things in the car, you know, you'll notice there's some bad quality textures here. But you gotta be nitpicking at this point. And that's really what I'm doing. I'm nitpicking for your benefit. This is a good port for the most part. But there is one other concern that I would like to bring to your attention, which is if you happen to have any kind of integrated graphics, you're going to want to try and turn them off. Because a lot of people, laptop users in particular, can't run the game unless they turn that off in the first place. Because the launcher is incompatible with integrated graphics cards. So the launcher detects the integrated graphics card and then crashes. This has been a big problem for people. There's like 10,000 posts on the forum about this. The fix is to turn it off either in, I think in the BIOS is probably the most reliable way of doing it. So just bear that one in mind. Is that a floating sign? Yes. Draw distance. Yes, quite. Anyway. If you are having any problems with integrated graphics cards, that's the way to fix it. If you have any kind of integrated graphics card, whether it be on your CPU or whether it be because you happen to be running on a laptop, you need to turn that off. My wife had a problem with it. She has a 680M, but her CPU also has integrated graphics, and it was detecting that and nothing else. And it was saying, nope, you can't run, crash, 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 crash. Outside of that, the Rockstar Social Club has not really been too much of a problem for people, although it is another form of DRM, so you can obviously expect it to be an issue from time to time when their servers decide to throw a wobbly. So just consider that. Outside of that, it's hard to criticize the PC version. It's obvious that they've laid a ton of work into it. It's clearly the best version, without a shadow of a doubt. It runs well on a wide variety of machines, and it has a great deal of scalability and a huge number of options. This is an example of a PC port done very, very well, as far as I'm concerned. And yeah, there are draw distance issues, and yes, we have described a few issues here and there with minor things for the most part, but I can still, I think, safely recommend the PC version of Grand Theft Auto 5. It sold 1 million copies in a day, so it's not like it needs my help. But ultimately, it deserved to sell 1 million copies because while they took a bloody long time to actually do it, it turned out to be the definitive version of the game by a country bloody mile. And let's be honest, GTA 5 is a bloody fantastic game in and of itself, so... Welcome to the land of 2015, GTA. Welcome to the land of post-30 FPS frame rates. I hope you enjoy yourself over here. But the wing mirrors don't work. Look at it. The wing mirrors suck. That's like the best criticism I can come up with. It's a damn good PC port, folks. It really is. I have no hesitation in recommending it for the vast majority of people, assuming that you have a computer that can actually run it. My name's been Total Biscuit. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.